I'm going to show you the first game between Carlsen and Nepomniachtchi in their World Championship match. Game 1, Nepo plays white, plays e4, and Carlsen plays e5, which is a bit of a surprise because we have seen him play c5 a lot, but e5 he's played this before, so not a big surprise. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and Carlsen has played the Berlin before, but he decides to go into Morphy defense a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles. Doesn't go for the open Ruy Lopez, so bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, all standard up until this point, castles. And now here Nepo played a slightly interesting move, which is h3. Normally white plays c3 in this position, and then after d6 plays h3 to stop bishop g4. But what's the subtlety with playing h3 first? I think the point is that if c3, then black has the martial attack with d5. And white doesn't want to go into these positions. If he takes, knight takes, rook takes e5, this position has been played hundreds, perhaps even thousands of times. And black knows all the different ways in which play can proceed here. c6, d4, bishop d6, rook e1, queen h4 now attacking h2. And this is how Carlsen himself played against Ivanchuk in 2017, and that game was drawn. So obviously Nepo is aware of all of this, and so he plays h3. I think the point here is if d5, then takes, knight takes, rook takes. And now, thanks to this square c3 being available, knight c3 is a possibility in the position. Whereas previously when the pawn was on c3, that was not an option. So imagine if c6, then rook comes back, move it to safety, bishop d6, and now knight c3 hits this guy. And white is able to get rid of this strong piece in black's position, and white can slowly start to consolidate with his extra material, which is the extra pawn. So that's the point of playing h3, at least that's what I think the point is. So h3. Carlsen could have played d6, but then white can play c3 and then goes into a normal Ruy Lopez. But instead Carlsen played an interesting move. He played knight a5, offering this pawn for free, which Nepo took, but then knight takes bishop, pawn takes, and bishop b7, and now he has two bishops versus white's knight and bishop. So he's got some dynamic compensation, and now he's attacking this pawn on e4, so d3. And black played d5, opening this up, and white has to allow the trade, because f3, I think move like f3 would be simply just wrong in this position, because the king is far too exposed with all these open squares against it. And I'm sure there must be some sort of immediate tactical refutation as well for this setup. But just from a positional consideration, f3 is not even a move that you would want to consider in this position. So d5, he has to take, queen takes, and now he's threatening a checkmate on g2. So Nepomniachtchi defends that with queen f3. And he also wants to trade queens because black's queen is the more dangerous queen in this position. Carlsen now played bishop d6. He's hitting this knight here. And Nepomniachtchi found it really interesting, or I wouldn't say he found it, he probably prepared this idea of king to f1, which it looks strange. Like, what are you doing with that king? But I think the point here is that, of course, the immediate point is if bishop takes, and then queen takes, and then you can just grab this guy, and if rook e8, then take, and now this king has covered the square, and the rook cannot just jump down to e1. So he's already prepared against that with king to f1. But I think the real point with king f1 is that Nepomniachtchi set up a trap for Carlsen. He wanted Carlsen to try queen takes knight. And you may say, wait, what's that? Rook takes queen, yeah, but then bishop takes this queen. So queen takes, white would have to take this guy, and now queen h2, and it looks like white is in some trouble, but I'm sure Nepomniachtchi prepared this, and here after queen f3, it turns out that white is completely safe and there's nothing black can do, and white's just a pawn up, and he's traded an important piece. If queen h1, for example, then king e2 check, bishop e3, he has to go back, king d1, and white's king is quite safe in this position. And so that's probably what Nepomniachtchi had in mind with that king f1 move. But Carlsen didn't fall for that. He defended this bishop with rook to b8, and now he is threatening queen e5. For example, if knight c3, then queen takes, and now he cannot take here because he's defended, and rook takes, bishop takes. Okay, so after rook f to b8, white had to take here to save this knight, and Carlsen took back. And here black is threatening to play knight b4 to hit white on c2, so he played bishop d2, and he's more than willing to simply swap this knight off and give black the two bishops, because in this position it doesn't matter because there is no queen on the board and those two bishops don't have any obvious targets, and white can play simply a move like knight c3 and start to consolidate and attempt to get an advantage from this position. Okay, so bishop d2 c5 from Carlsen. Nepomniachtchi played knight f3. He thinks it's good to bring his knight back and relieve this rook of the defense on that knight. And Carlsen decided to shuffle his rook to d8 so that he could bring the other rook over here. And I must say that in this position, it's really hard for white to make his extra pawn work to his good. So knight c3 was tried, but then knight b4 hitting c2, and Nepo defended with rook c1, rook e to c1, so that this rook stays on this rank, this file, to target a6 if it becomes weak, as it will later on in the game. So rook c1, rook c8, knight e2, knight c6. Players are simply testing each other out here. There's nothing concrete here. And bishop e3 again. White wants to get a move like d4 in the position if he can, because he wants to make his extra pawn felt. So that's always an idea in the position for white. So knight e7. Now he's targeting bishop takes knight. And Nepo here, I think he realized that he doesn't really have any concrete plans, so he played this rather interesting move, bishop f4, offering a trade of bishops, and which Carlsen was happy to do. Bishop takes knight first. Now he's successfully ruptured this pawn structure on the king side, and then takes, knight takes. And now, as we mentioned earlier, there's this threat of the rook takes pawn on a6, which is why this rook stayed on a1. So black defends that with rook to c6. Now here white is up a pawn, but look at this. 1, 2, 3. These pawns are all in their own islands, and white's extra pawn is also doubled. So it's not easy to get the extra pawn to count for white in this position. Rook to e1 attacks the knight, so knight f5. Now he's threatening to go knight d4 and then hit c2 and f3 at the same time. So white plays c3, stops that, and temporarily d3 is now weak, because if this knight moves away, then d3 is falling. And if, in fact, if g5 and knight g2, black could take on d3. Unfortunately for black, white had rook e5 in the position, and now this knight has to be defended, and if rook f6, then, well, c5 is dropping, and if this knight moves, then g5 is dropping. So that wasn't working for black. It was still a level position, but Carlsen didn't want a level position. He wanted to play for the win, so he played knight h4 attacking this pawn, and rook e3, king f8. So now he's playing his slow maneuvering game to provoke white to make a mistake. Knight g2, offering a trade of knights, which he refuses. Knight f5, rook e5 hits him, g6. And now here Nepo played knight e1 to hold this pawn, but I think that was quite passive. Instead, I think he should have played king e2, and then if, let's say, f6, rook e4, knight g7, rook d1, he could have shuffled and got his king over to the queen side here. It would be a much better version of what he actually got in the game, which we shall see. So instead, he played knight to e1 here, knight g7, rook e4. You can see that white doesn't really have easy moves. He has to just keep coming back and forth, and black can play moves like f5 and knight e6. And now white is simply responding to black's threats. b4, this was a critical moment in the game because Carlsen is playing for something concrete. As you can see, this pawn here on b3 is really hard to defend. Black's rook is probably intending to come down this way and target that pawn that way, and it's not easy to hold that pawn. It's not defended by any pawns. Plus, if white takes on b4, then that's creating a huge hole in the position on d4. So that's not to white's advantage either. But here Nepo found the right solution. He played king to e2, and after rook b8, he played king to d2, saying, you can take my pawn, but I want to consolidate my position. Let's see what would have happened if he had insisted on protecting this pawn. So let's say a rook b1. The point being, of course, if takes, then takes, and now the rook defends that pawn. But black could play a5, and suppose now king d2, then take, and now a4. Because now if pawn takes pawn, then obviously rook takes rook. If pawn up here, then, well, takes, and knight d4, and problems. So that would not be pretty for white. So instead, Nepo correctly played king e2, sacrificing this pawn like that, but then king c2, and now he has completely consolidated his queen side. And now black has significant weaknesses. He has got a6 as a weakness here, and c5 as a weakness as well. So that dynamically compensates for white's weaknesses on the king side. So king c2, rook b7 moves him back. And here I was quite stunned by this move that Nepo played, h4, which, wow, that was not the move that I was expecting. But as I pondered on this, I realized that Nepo's point is probably that h4 stops a future g5, because you can just take, which means that if this knight moves, white is ready to jump in with knight f4. So now, because you can't hit with g5 anymore. So Nepo is saying to Carlsen, well, if you ever move this knight, my knight's going to jump into f4, which means that these two knights are probably perpetually going to stay that way. And if black cannot move this knight, then black cannot make any progress. White doesn't have any progress to make either, but white's saying you can't make any progress either. And so that's probably the thinking behind playing h4, stopping that g5 idea. So Carlsen plays king f7, rook e1, king f6, and now Nepo sees that, okay, he may be playing h6 and g5, so he's going to take away my f4 square, so might as well reroute this knight here and take the c4 square, because that's a really good square for my knight. And he jumps in, and white's position is completely fine now. In fact, it's black who is slightly on the defensive, because this knight is going to e5 and forking those two rooks, and he's got a5 covered, so black can never push a5. And white has really strong positional control with this knight, because this square on b2 is also defended by that knight, so his rooks cannot come down this way. So the knight on c4 is completely controlling all of the key squares in the position. So Carlsen realized that there's nothing, and he played rook e7 now, stopping knight e5. And Nepo thought here for a while and realized that he doesn't have much either. So he played knight e5, attacks this rook. The rook has to stay with this pawn, so he played rook d6, back to c4. Again, he has to stay with them, so rook c6. And they repeated moves and made a draw. So that was game one. I hope you enjoyed this brief explanation for all the whys in this game. And I look forward to explaining more the rationale for the moves that the players make in the future games.